we have a very exciting concluding panel where after having been exposed and discussing so many very specific issues, challenges, and expertise was shown on very different topics on all these sessions of these past 2 days. This session is going to be broader, and we're going to look at some of the forest issues, not only each specific tree. And they relate to, obviously, the issues of governance. Governance matters, and that's why the session is called that way. Rather than going at length as to the evidence that governance matters, we will start this session presuming that the evidence is already overwhelming, and that's why we're here. I just spent some time at lunchtime. I had to go to a different conference. It's a long time commitment that is happening at Oxford on development and governance and the post-2015 goals. They're still discussing whether governance matters. So I did, as usual, a bit of provocation regarding that issue, and we should move onwards to the next stage. And I think among ourselves, that issue is pretty much settled. Of course, the devil is in the details. What do we mean by governance? What types of governance are more important than others? And then, most importantly, how do countries go about it? What are the lessons of what works and what doesn't? Yesterday, we heard from Michael Ross that we don't know much, if anything. Some of us think that we have learned, especially from things that don't work and some few things that do work. We have a very exciting panel in that context. I won't do full justice to the very impressive credentials and bias of everybody here for the sake of time, so I'll be very brief. Also, you have seen some of them before in other panels. To my left, to my left, I have Albert Zofak, a senior manager from the World Bank. To his left, Memunatu Prat, the head of the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sierra Leone. To her left, Edward Bickham, senior advisor at the World Gold Council. And to his left, who was with us earlier in the day again, the Honorable Claire Short, who is the chair of EITI, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. So each one of them bring a very unique perspective from different stakeholders. What we're going to do in this session is to have it very lively and interactive. And we have already discussed that provocation is encouraged, and the same will be from the floor. Actually, it's not from the floor, it's from the podium going up. It's really nice to see, for once, a stage which is much lower than the participants, because I think that's the right pecking order. So what we'll do is that I will be posing at the start one question each to the participant, one different question on this topic of governance. There will be a brief reaction from each one of the panelists. We'll spearhead a little bit of discussion and debate among them, and then we'll go to the floor and continue with the discussion and debate on this important issue. So they are not going to be lengthy presentations, no PowerPoints, that's a promise, and not even from world bankers or former world bankers, which I know it's really tough, but we will ascribe to that. So we will start from the most important perspective, and no offense to the other, each perspective is important, but it's from the ground, from the producing country. And that's Menumatu, again, Menumatu Prat. You'll go first, and we do know that in your eminent experience and capacity as heading in that department in your university, and your writings, in fact, on what you call the resource blessing, you can provide particular insights on the question, what are the most important dimensions of governance in your country? Because we talk about governance, but often we don't unpackage enough, and we stay at a general level. So what are the most important dimensions that can make the difference for harnessing natural resources for development and for also peace and stability, which has been your quest and your research. And then from that, if you can mention, to get the discussion started, what you think the 2 priority areas for reform that Sierra Leone needs to focus on now for really travel towards improved governance in natural resources.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, I am quite sure that a number of you are very much familiar with the Sierra Leone situation, and that Sierra Leone is a country which has been through 11 years of war, and we have been able to enjoy 12 years of post-conflict peace building and longer-term development. So the fundamental questions which we would like to ask is, number 1, what have been the critical issues that led Sierra Leone to war that has to do with resource governance? Now, if you look at most of the literature that were written in terms of describing the situation in Sierra Leone, there is this whole concept about resource course. And in fact, if you look at our Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, the resource course was translated into the main ingredient that prolonged the war, and then that caused the war to go on so long and then to cause so many devastation, because a whole dependency syndrome was there in terms of looking at those resources in fueling the war in the interest either of Charles Taylor or the then rebel leader Foday Sankoh. So what did this bring to us when we went into the post-conflict peace building era, when we came back with a destructive economy, with a disjointed political system, with a social system that was completely, there was a complete breakdown. So it means that we needed to harness what we have in terms of our economic resources in order that we can be able to translate and transform the functioning of Sierra Leone. Now, so what have we done so far in terms of looking at the issues of governance? Number 1, we have been able to put together an open, transparent, and accountability system. And in putting together the open, transparent, and accountability system, we have tried to look at the different strands of the open accountability system: politically, social accountability, and then economic accountability. Politically, we've managed to put together governance structures that must be responsive to the needs of Sierra Leone. So we have a governance system wherein we have national government, we have local government, and then we have traditional structures. But these are not an end in themselves. There are critical challenges to these structures in terms of dealing with natural resource governance. And then also we've put together national democratic institutions. The Anti-Corruption Commission, which deals with corruption issues. We have the Human Rights Commission, which deals with human rights issues. The Political Party Registration Commission. We have commissions that deal with child rights, that deal with issues that deal with women. And then also we have commissions that deal with the reform of the rule of law. Now, so we've been able to put these structures together in order to respond to some of these issues in terms of building an accountable democratic society. And following that, we've managed to have 3 successive elections, and these elections have actually helped in trying to build political processes and then also building political parties in order that we can have a government that is very much inclusive. Now, economically, so much has gone on, but the key here is that after the war, we found out that there is a whole range of opportunities for Sierra Leone if we can be able to transform our resources very well. So we've managed to put together systems and controls in trying to handle some of this, but notwithstanding, there are huge challenges with some of them. Now, some of them has to do with contracts, with mining licenses, with agreements. The major areas of challenges with that has to do with, 1, because of the desperation after the war for us to engage in some form of economic reconstruction, the government involved itself in some contracts and agreements that are now detrimental to the state, which means that excess of waivers, tax holidays were granted to some of these companies. And in fact, as recently as last week, a report was released which says that Sierra Leone has lost something like $240 million in tax waivers as a result of those agreements, which is even more than the development budgets then from 2011 to 2012. So it means we have a challenge. Now, socially, In terms of looking at the governance issues, basically that has to do with providing access to education, to health issues, and then even providing access to roads and infrastructure. Some form of development has taken place with regards to the roads and infrastructure. But the fact remains that there is a huge divide between the rural and urban areas. If you go to Sierra Leone today, you will see the reconstruction going on, but you will see the difference in terms of looking at the way in which the rural communities up till now needs to have better road networks in order that they can be able to have access to services. Now, then let me move on to the two main important priorities with regards to Sierra Leone. One has to do with accountable, we need to develop an accountable and improved public financial management system, which has to deal with our auditing processes, deals with the way in which we manage our company revenues and resources, and then also with deals in the way in which government expends public money. Because part of the problem is how do we monitor how much money goes out into contracts in terms of roads, in terms of infrastructure, and then how that affects the amount of revenue that comes in the face of the kind of revenue losses we are having as a result of some of these agreements. I think that is very major. The second is harmonization of existing acts and laws. Now, because of the manner in which companies we are coming in and negotiating different contracts and agreements, we have laws and policies which to some extent are not harmonized. And then we have certain aspects of the laws that affect quite a number of people. For instance, the issue of land grabbing. Land grabbing is a very big problem today in Sierra Leone. And if you look at our land tenure system, we have dual land tenure system. So it means that, like for instance, when you say the people who own lands in the rural areas who have been used to farming, these lands have now been licensed to companies for them to operate in. So it has affected the lives of those people to an extent that it's becoming very difficult in terms of building a strong relationship between people living in those communities, the government, and then also general civil society. So we have issues around that. And the last thing I'd like to say about the land issue is that we have an act which is called the Mines and Minerals Act of 2009. One big aspect of that act is the fact that there is a clause which talks about you can own the land, but you don't own the minerals that you find within that land. So it means that the whole of the minerals in Sierra Leone belongs to the government or to Sierra Leone. But then you can have the land. And if on that particular land, the minerals have been discovered, what you only have to receive from that land is just surface rent. So now we have a serious problem with regards to how these people may want to understand that in terms of having land for so many years, and then now all what the people will benefit from it are surface rent in terms of percentages that are articulated in the agreement. So we are faced with a very challenging situation. In some of the mining companies, when it comes to relocation, there are big problems because we have situations where people are relocated to areas which they don't want to go to. Basic social services are absent in those areas. So these are the kinds of things which are happening in the mining sector. But in general, there has been the will for the review of all of those licenses. And up till now, we still need to develop transparent systems in terms of making public license agreements so that people may see what is there. And then also having the process wherein civil society and government can have a good partnership in terms of looking at the way in which the mining and the extractives is being addressed, especially within the context of governance and sound democratic system.
This was great. And you said we need some governance and democratic system, but there has been a major progress, compared with the times of the Civil War, in terms of the development and advancement on democratic institutions. What is the most important next stage from your perspective on the development of the democratic institution, the civil society side? You just mentioned the problem of land tenure and displacement and maybe forced relocation. So what's next if you were to...
Danny, can I add to that? The war was absolutely devastating. Right. And to rebuild the country, have democratic elections, have change of government peacefully is an enormous achievement.
Absolutely.
But the human development indicators are terrible. Would you like to comment on that? I know yours is a governance question, but there's a big place in my heart for Sierra Leone because I was working there in that time. And I look at the human development indicators and I think, oh, Because you usually get a boom in a country after a war.
They may be related, though.
Yes. I think on the issue of us saying that we are having successful mining, and then when you look at the human development indicator, it's really, really very, very not good. It's not so good. Now, for me, from my own perspective, in terms of looking at what is happening, is that I think what we need to do is we need to try and balance our priorities as a state. Now, there is this overarching demand for infrastructural development, which is good. But what has not been able to happen is how do you balance infrastructural development with social development indicators? So it means that more money is going into roads, construction of roads, and very less is going into social human development. Now, if you go, you can clearly see that you see a lot of construction work going on, which is good. We need the roads, but then you see a diminishing return in terms of the human resource investment, which is really a very serious problem. That is why now, if you speak to an average Sierra Leonean, they will tell you that life is hard, inflation is hard, things are not getting better for us, we need more resources, we need good salaries, we need good housing. So how do the government create a balance between investment in infrastructure and then also creating a balance in human development? So I think that is where we are. So that seems to be a very big challenge. And in fact, that has eaten into the political competitive processes of the state, which means that a number of people who may belong to one party are of the view that infrastructural development is taking much money that is unaccounted for. So there are lots of ramifications with regards to that. But one other thing I like to say is that the politics of Sierra Leone is also another challenge. The politics of Sierra Leone is mainly in two straight divides. You have the southeast flank, and then you have the northwest. And over the period, even before independence, but it became more intensified after independence, you have one political party that has a dominance on one side, and then you have another political party, a dominance on the other side, which has translated into ethnic divisions. And these ethnic divisions has actually pierced a number of issues. So it's even making it very difficult, even when we want to talk about how do we build a system which we can create a balance, that people have this way of seeing development from different political perspectives.
Great.
Now,
Yeah.
let me stop.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, go ahead. What's the line?
Okay. Now, then I can now propel this into the issue of governance. So it means that there is a whole range of mistrust and suspicion between key groups, and it's even getting very much difficult for civil society, in some instances, for them to actually come out and then actually make their voices very heard. But notwithstanding, the civil society and the media are doing a very good job. In fact, if there's a civil society that belongs to the extractive sector that actually now produces all of these reports that has now come to the public and that people are knowing about all what is happening, the leakages and all of that, and trying to say to government, you need to do something in terms of arresting some of these leakages which we are having. So in essence, in as much as we have the structures, but because of, in some cases, over-politicization, in some cases, because of politics of patronage, the politics of patronage has returned again, and the politics of paying back. So to some extent, it has really had an impact in all of this what we are talking about. So we are in a situation where we are making progress in terms of the institution, but we need to do more to build an accountable process, the inclusive process, and transparent process from the executive, the legislative, the judiciary, civil society, and the like. So accountability is extremely important. And in fact, currently, we are undergoing a constitutional review process, wherein one of the issues which we are discussing is about the executive powers of the presidency. people feel that that should be reduced because everything, appointments and everything dwells in the presidency. It has got enormous power in terms of taking decisions. So these are some of the issues. But we hope with a constitutional review, we can be able to get somewhere and see how we can create a balance in terms of checks and balances in terms of the democratic and governance system.
Thank you. Well, Albert Menumato has had such a message to you and me because we are proud economists, but politics and accountability matter enormously. Yet the economic, technical, finance, and related aspects are incredibly important too. So we'll turn to you now. You come from Cameroon. You have a vast experience in matters of economic development, finance, and natural resources. A lot focused on Africa, but you also have worked a lot in Asia. So it would be very interesting from your perspective to know what, and you're a World Banker, but you don't need to just wear an official World Bank hat in your comments because this is a very interactive and frank panel. From your perspective, what are the main challenges faced, not only in the Sierra Leones and the Cameroon, but more broadly in the African continent, and to what extent there are similarities or main differences also with other regions? Because we tend still to have too much of a regional view and work in silos sometimes, including until right now in the World Bank, although it's supposed to change with the new reforms and so on. So whatever interesting is your perspective, and we broaden it to other countries and issues.
Thank you, Danny. Yes, I like to think of myself as being from a country that developed the wrong model for natural resource management, and having worked most of the time on a country that is close to a role model. So, I try to filter these two experiences from Cameroon and Malaysia into this discussion, but more broadly on Southeast Asia and the Great Lakes in Africa, where I'm currently working. Well, I think President Nyerere of Tanzania was once asked a similar question. He was asked to speak of corruption in Africa and Asia and compare. And he said there is one similarity and one difference. The similarity is both in Asia and Africa, when there is a serious procurement, it's always going to be someone close to the president who will win. The difference, though, is in Asia, the very close relative of the president will make something happen. In Africa, nothing would get done. And I want to bring this discussion to the natural resource agenda because one of the two broad lessons that I've learned working on these two continents is that there is one big similarity, which is political pressure is extremely high on national oil companies, is extremely high on agents working in the natural resource sector. It's exactly the same. Pressure is very high. Well, Malaysia included Malaysia. So, but the big difference is that in Asia, some countries manage to create corporate governance in some of these oil companies that actually generate higher efficiency and that are managed privately. In Africa, most of the time, these oil companies and the new sovereign funds are basically the ATM of the president or his family. That's, to my view, one huge difference. Couple of areas where I think we should be focusing our efforts to improve governance of natural resources, learning from that experience, is the first. I think I have 4 points here. First is that transparency has started to yield some results, but there is not enough transparency, and there will never be enough transparency. The question, to my view here, is how do we harness that transparency to get accountability? And in most of the countries I'm working on in Africa, you have situations where the country can be claiming to be EITI compliant while refusing an audit of the national oil company at the same time, while that oil company or that sovereign wealth fund is managed by the son of the president. So we need to move progressively, continue pushing for transparency, but start to work out mechanism to translate transparency into real accountability. And accountability is not just for governments. And I'm learning with the countries I'm involved in that there is a different agency problem that I didn't see before, which is parliaments. Parliaments in some of these countries are basically an extension of governments. Clear extensions of governments, and even when texts are sent to Parliament, through the back door, the government can write whatever they want into those texts, and there is nothing else that goes without the government dictating everything there. So the assumption that parliaments are actually representing the people is something we also have to start questioning and start seeing how to actually understand those linkages. And to me, it has a very, very important governance implication, because the other point, quite important and probably common on both in Asia and Africa, is that the major oil companies have similar behavior, and they are extremely aggressive, and it's extremely difficult for government officials, both in Asia and Africa, to resist the temptation for corruption. It's extremely difficult in both places. That's a fact. And now, if parliaments are basically extensions of governments, the pressure is also moving into parliament. So we need to rethink our, assistance or our discussions on civil society, especially, how do we empower parliaments? We need to rethink this. The second point, the second point I really want to mention here, and I've alluded to it already, is the corporate governance of sovereign wealth fund and national oil companies, because in some countries they are all the same, right? If you take Petronas is actually the oil fund for Malaysia. You take Pertamina, you take a couple of other companies in East Asia are actually oil funds. The big difference is the mechanism through which the revenues transit to the budget. Is it full transmission, or do some companies keep some of the resources to invest on their own, like Petronas? I know in the case of Indonesia, it's full transmission. In Africa, it's completely murky at this point in time. And most countries opening or launching sovereign wealth funds are probably just seeing it in terms of, another box, or to invest, abroad, or to buy foreign assets, or the other complete opposite, to invest in the domestic economy. So we need to clearly look at trying to open the black box of sovereign wealth fund and get governance into these companies. The third point I would like to mention is subnational fiscal transfers in natural resource-rich economies. This is an area where we are, at the World Bank, still struggling to understand. It's extremely political. It has huge risk, including conflict, and we need to be able not only to help countries with designing proper fiscal transfer rules, but also manage governance in the chain, because one thing that happens, and that could happen more and more, is that we decentralize corruption into subnational governments with natural resources. And last point is on public investment. Governance needs to really, we need to really look into governance of scaling up public investment in most of these countries. We've been talking at the World Bank about public investment management. The IMF has been talking about public investment management, but it goes beyond the mechanics of project selection and procurement. I think the institutional framework for this investment, including the role of foreign companies in investment, in Chinese and Europeans, Americans, I think we need to look into this a little bit more critically. Thanks.
Thank you, Albert. This is very important, and I know you made an enormous effort to make it here on time, and you just arrived. We can reverse engineer and mention to you that all the 4 points, key points that you mentioned, have been mapped to a very particular session that this conference already had, and very much in depth, and I'm sure there will be questions and discussion after that to those very important points. One of your important points, of course, is the notion of accountability. It's not only about and towards government officials, and you mentioned Parliament very importantly. And next we will go to Edward in the private sector. It also applies, but before that, a word of humility also. It applies also to us in NGOs, civil society more broadly, as Claire often reminds us. So it's a mutual responsibility or accountability issue. Who monitors the monitors? It's a perennial question, and it's right, so it applies across the board. But let's go now to your vast experience with the corporate sector. It's no secret, like any stakeholder, there's no uniformity. I mean, they are great champions of reforms and leaders in government, in civil society, in parliament, even in the World Bank. But the same applies, the corporate sector is extremely diverse, and there are some that have very much resisted this agenda of reform and transparency and accountability, particularly regarding natural resources, and more particularly on the oil sector, although mining is known to be divided on that. So your perspective on this is very important. First, what, in your view, have been the main achievements in terms of the corporate sector, the private sector, in natural resources, helping spearhead governance reforms, or at least being associated with, whether it's in transparency or beyond, and accountability, but also, very frankly, from your perspective, what are the pending challenges? Because we know that they still are there from the private sector perspective.
Well, you've only told me I've got a very few minutes to talk, so I won't answer all of them in great detail points, but I'll try and make 3 points. First of all, to my mind, certainly Western publicly listed corporations have a significant interest in good governance. I think we've moved beyond the Stone Age view of the resource curse. Is this not right? Yeah. We've moved beyond the Stone Age version of the resource curse, where just the existence of resources led to bad things. I think we've moved away from determinism to identifying governance as the key trigger. And for an international investor, good governance is more likely to lead to reduced political risk, to relative stability, less likelihood of conflict, reduced corruption and legal risk, and I'd say also people often assume sort of multinational companies, they probably like weak governments, and I think that's not true. If you're a resource business, if you're trying to generate trust, what you want is a good government partner, so the citizens of the country believe that you're being held to account. And particularly in dealing around environmental issues with communities, they need reassurance that someone's in their corner, and they're not likely necessarily to assume that companies are always beneficent. And so good governance can create the rights of environment for new investments. So there's a good self-interest on the corporate side to be on the side of the angels. Secondly, I think a key thing is a company's own conduct. And whilst a company has to work within the legal framework provided by the host government, there are ways in which they can go above and beyond what's prescribed in statute. So it may be that all you have to do technically is an environmental impact assessment. But actually, there's very rarely something that says you can't do a social impact assessment on top of that. So conducting ourselves as companies in line with things like the UN Guiding Principles, not only having codes of conduct that look good on the website, but actually are really embedded, and social management processes that are embedded as opposed to statements of good intent is crucially important. And I've been quite involved with the gold industry around the OECD process for responsible sourcing of minerals. And that's about moving away from the idea that because you may have invested or you may be investing in a difficult governance area, that you should run away when things get worse, because that then makes the spiral downwards generally worse. And that responsible investment can make stabilization easier if responsible players stay there. The difficulty has been, how do you define what responsible investment looks like? So the OECD has had its go at that, looking through due diligence back as to the impacts. And for the gold industry, I've been involved in trying to develop what a company operating in a conflict-affected zone needs to do in terms of application of the guiding principles, the voluntary principles, security and human rights, transparency, etc., so that there's accountability. So that's the second point is...
And you have been supportive of the 1502 provision of Dodd-Frank, which tries to tackle it from a mandatory...
Well, that's a separate issue. Can I come back to that? Just give me do my third point, which is going to take us on to EITI. That companies have to walk a difficult line. They have to maintain their license to operate, so they have to avoid getting into deep politics. They can't start identifying themselves with the opposition, or they will find themselves quite often closed down. So they need to find a way of contributing to the debate around good governance in partnership with others, contributing their knowledge of what works in other countries, perhaps co-hosting with civil society organisations or reformist groups within government, roundtables that looks at best practice, bringing people in, engaging in a conversation and reinforcing reformist groups. And EITI, one of the attractions for companies, is that it allows companies to work with civil society and with government to be part of the solution rather than being painted in the corner of the problem. Other areas where I think that clearly companies can contribute to the governance challenge is around capacity building. It is extremely difficult to get good development outcomes in the region around a mine if you don't have a capacitated local government, and often you don't. Now that then leads to the tendency to do health and education as if you were the government. And that clearly isn't sustainable, it's deeply undesirable, it doesn't lead to accountability. So working with civil society again to do that capacity building, or with donors, and helping to ensure that when the money is generated, that it's well spent. Now, in relation to your question on 1502, in terms of the gold industry, gold mining industry, it doesn't have a position on 1502. I only notice that most mining companies that I interact with don't have a particular problem with sorry, actually, hang on, sorry, 1502. 1502 is not a major problem. I was for a moment thinking, Danny, you were asking about 1504, which also creates Pavlovian reactions. And I don't think the gold miners actually have a particular problem with either. The question with 1502 in relation to the specifics of the DRC is whether the short-term unintended consequences have, which is certainly in the tin, tantalum, tungsten businesses, driven quite a lot of people out of their livelihoods, whether that was a price worth paying.
And it was a disaster, and civil society in the north was guilty of, with good intention, but hurting a lot of poor people in eastern DRC in a way that was indefensible. Myself.
I promise some debate. It's going to, it's coming. And to finish, 1504, what's your position?
1504, similarly, there are issues around the right definition of projects, which cause real problems about where you've got infrastructure shared between a number of operations as to how you define that. But the principle, I don't find that there's much problems, and indeed, certainly a number of the leading gold miners have been involved in the development of the proposals in Canada.
And including on the principle of significant level of disaggregation.
Yep.
Great. We just had a very spirited debate with the American petroleum industry representative at a Brookings panel on 1504. So on the oil side, they are still opposing it very much, as you know, and on many different grounds. In spite of the fact that other constituencies are so clearly jumped aboard the train of transparency at a very detailed level, and so on. But the big oil is not there.
And I don't think we should, without them being able to state their position in this meeting, necessarily assume that all their objections are spurious. There are, I think, some genuine points there between the clash between home country and host country legislation, which is a real issue, but I'm not going to particularly argue for them or against them. I just think we should log they exist.
Okay. Fair enough. It was also discussed and pointed out that the evidences may not be there, and it didn't come. No country came up as a real evidence of that clash, but that can be left for a follow-up debate, because we're so keen to hear. Claire, you have such a broad perspective, obviously, as a chair of EITI. As Edward put it very eloquently, it's multi-stakeholder, so you bring the perspective of many, but you also bring your perspective from before also, as a great eminent politician. So, bring us your vision on where we stand now in terms of both the challenge and the achievements on natural resource governance, and within that, where does EITI fit? Because you are a great reminder, being also on the board with you there. You remind us all that EITI cannot do it all, and you say it, but so it would be very useful to put this as part of the discussion. So we have this perspective that for different type of objectives and goals, which are so many in the natural resource governance, there are different instruments. And EITI could be the perfect and great instrument for A and B, but not for C and D. So to give us that perspective, and given all the reflections that we have heard already.
Right, well, thank you. Firstly, I'm more optimistic than Albert about the change that's taken place in Africa. It's not complete, but I think there have been improvements in governance. There's been considerable improvements in economic growth for a longer period than any other since independence. There's been the growth of a middle class with all sorts of economic consequences of their demand and so on. I think the biggest problem, and it reflects the Sierra Leone point, is the growth of inequality. And we now have the IMF telling us in London, because we've had a growth of inequality in the UK and the OECD countries as well, that if there's a lot of low-income people without the capacity to consume, the economy does less well. So the IMF isn't saying here's a moral point. They're saying if you want a prospering, growing economy, lower income people need to participate and be included and consume, and that helps the economy to grow. And so I think it's relevant to the human development point in the UK as well as in Africa. And I just want us to think when we're all talking about what should developing countries do. If you look at the history of coal mining in Britain, the disasters and conflicts and accidents and general strike and terrible conditions, you know, it's not just Africa. Managing this sector is difficult, and every country's got its story and bitterly and hard-won lessons, and we need to keep that perspective. On EITI's achievements, and although it was started the discussion between companies, governments and civil society in my time as a minister in the Department for International Development, most of the early development has been when I wasn't engaged. I became the chair in 2011. And I would say the idea, which came from NGOs campaigning saying these rotten companies aren't paying any revenues and there's a commodity boom and it's not fair, and publish what you pay. And it was very much in that sort of critical spirit, Global Witness and Publish What You Pay, which seemed big, but was a small number really compared with where it is now, of British development NGOs. And there was a discussion between companies, governments and civil society, an agreement that transparency would benefit all. For a variety of different reasons, the companies were fed up with being attacked and thought they did pay. The governments wanted a good reputation for inward investment, and the civil society wanted more money for poor people. So they came together saying, let's have transparency. So that was a narrow remit, because just revenue transparency is not enough, but it brought together the multi-stakeholder approach on the ground in countries, not just a conference, not just some papers, important as intellectual analysis is, but 44 countries now, government, civil society, companies meeting together, getting to know and understand each other. I mean, in the past there's been just total lack of trust and blame to all sides. Suddenly they're tackling the problem together, facing up to what the money is, starting to have a more informed debate about the challenge of using it well and managing the sector well. I think, and the multi-stakeholder reality, which we have at the international board, but country by country, and transparency becoming a norm, just an expectation, not just of sort of academics or critics or the World Bank, but of normal folk in countries saying, come on, we're part of this, other countries can have it, why can't we have it? I think that's a very considerable achievement. Right. And I would say that's the achievement of phase one. Where are we now, and what more needs to be done to get real transparency becoming accountability? Simply revenue reporting is too narrow. It got us started, but we now in the Sydney conference have widened to say the licensing system must be open. We're doing a pilot on beneficial ownership, encourage the publication of contracts, bring in state-owned companies. My goodness, there's going to be some challenge in that, but bring them in, expect them to report and to be transparent, and so on. And that's going to be a much bigger challenge, but much more significant, because you're going right along the chain with the expectation of openness and transparency. And all our governments have signed up to this. It hasn't been imposed from Oslo or something. It's agreed by all. So deepening and widening. And secondly, not just having a more and more elaborate EITI report so you can tick the box and send it to Oslo and be called an EITI compliant country. And we need to explain to people, compliant simply means compliant with the reporting requirements of the EITI. It doesn't mean you've done it all and the sector is well managed in this country. And I think we should start calling reporting countries, because it's very misleading. And of course, we still want the incentive of countries want to be there and want to get the label, but then everyone thinks, how can this country with all these problems be called compliant? It's a problem, and we need to put that right. So we're in process of that second challenge, and it's a big one. But the other part of it, I think, is widening what we mean by civil society. At the moment, it's too often thought that sort of northern NGOs that can apply for funding and have got representatives in developing countries is civil society. Now, they're an important group, but civil society is the academics, the journalists, the parliamentarians. Yes, there are limitations, but they've got to be in it because they scrutinise the budget, and maybe they'll become a more informed group. faith leaders. You know, in poor countries, the leaders of religious groupings are enormously close to the poor, and just them being part of the debate and knowing what the reality is and sharing that information. So I think it's a real challenge, because that's what civil society is. It isn't just people who know how to apply for grants. They're a means to an end. And not the fancy report, only sending it to Oslo, but leveraging transparency into government systems so there's permanent transparency. And the report becomes much more a debate about how to manage these resources, how they should be invested, how long will they last, how should we use them for the benefit of our country. And then EITI can become increasingly a network of countries learning from each other. And if, over the next phase, countries' own systems become much more transparent, civil society becomes much broader and much more deeply informed, and the transparency reaches wider, I think the achievements will be considerable. And that's the next period of years.
And let me ask you on that context, and then we will open it up. There is no question, and of course I'm not neutral, that you should derive enormous pride on the game-changing progress in EITI from going from the old norms and standards to the new ones, which broaden the whole scope of transparency in the way that you just described very eloquently, and there was an earlier session, very significantly, including the enormous challenge of state-owned enterprises. So it's not just the onus on the private corporates and so on, and many other, including getting into subnational issues, which you mentioned. And
yes,
so on.
Peru's doing an EITI on subnational, because, you know, they're very decentralized, which is...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I was part of the great meeting with the whole multi-sectoral group there in Peru, with all the representatives. The dynamics is game-changing of what this can generate with a corporate sector. So the broadening is happening. Peru is a great case, because Peru has an extremely vibrant also democracy, civil society, and the way they are all brought in. The question that is still pending is the translation to full-fledged accountability in many countries that are not Peru. So you have broadening of transparency, but it's still the risk of what we have been accused of calling zombie transparency. So it's disclosure, and instead of disclosure on one narrow aspect, which is just revenue payments, it's disclosure on 7 aspects. But then there are reports that come. So you would not be surprised that I mentioned, just as an example and an illustration, the case of Azerbaijan. Forget Oslo, forget the northern NGOs, whether in New York, in London, or in Brussels. Just the people in Azerbaijan that quietly and very afraidedly are clamoring for help because of the totally repressive regime, and saying very clearly, look, these are just reports. If we start analyzing and publishing anything in the press or in the blogs, we're put in jail. We are put at personal risk and so on. So the question that Albert posed of translating transparency to accountability, if I had to guess, because we follow the numbers and the data and the evidence, there's probably a group of about 30 or so countries, fortunately not all, but it's very significant, that have extremely repressive environment for civil society. What's the theory of change, and what can we do in the next stage, including with tools of, with great initiatives like EITI and others in that context? Isn't that still a pending challenge?
Indeed, and as you know, quite a number of our member countries, now reporting countries, have governance problems and are very authoritarian.
Right.
There's no question. Now, Human Rights Watch would have us kind of kick out everyone who doesn't give full freedom to civil society. I think, I don't speak for them, but you understand the point. Whereas I think our job is to say there must be enough space for civil society to engage with the EITI, to scrutinise the figures and to debate. And then you get some openness that you preserve that might well lead for reform. I haven't been to Azerbaijan recently, and I know Revenue Watch keeps bringing it up at the board, and I don't know whether you want to expel it or what your strategy is. But I've just been to Kazakhstan.
Don't worry, Revenue Watch won't do anything anymore. It will be NRGI.
Well, whatever the initials. But I've just been to Kazakhstan. Now, it's a similar country. very authoritarian, power very concentrated in the presidency and his family. But because they're so dedicated to having the EITI label, they allow civil society in this sector to be operational in the way they don't allow it in any other. There was a labour dispute and I think some people were shot. I met with civil society. They're very argumentative about, you know, how critical of the government they should be, etc. Now, it seems to me, I would say preserve that. It's far from perfect, but it's a space. And even transparency where there's weak accountability prevents some grand corruption because it's more difficult to do when things are open. And if you've got some space where people are allowed to organise, scrutinise, come to the table, that's worth preserving. I mean, each case, it's a judgment. But in Kazakhstan, which I think can be criticised as much as Azerbaijan, they wouldn't have it if EITI wasn't there.
Yeah.
So that's...
Yeah, look, and that's a different debate when you throw the whole baby out with the bathwater and expelling or not. The question is whether countries that are so challenged in that context and therefore transparency is not being translated to accountability should be giving a stamp of approval to the whole world as fully green-lined and compliant rather than having basically some message that this is not acceptable.
But you see, I think it's the misleading nature of the word compliance. All it means is compliant with EITI reporting requirements. And that includes at least some space for civil society to scrutinise, etc. But the compliant word has been thrown around so much, it sounds like...
Okay, we'll go...
Good governance.
1 minute to Edward and then to Albert who are acting to talk, and then we go to the audience.
I agree with at least 90% of what Claire's just said. Let's not get bogged down onto reporting countries, compliant countries, etc., just this discussion. But it does seem to me that EITI does provide a bridgehead for civil society, a bridgehead that should, through the demonstration to the rest of society, what's being done around resource revenues and the debate that will be created around that, is an opportunity to spread, whereas if you cast those countries into outer darkness, that won't happen, and indeed the ability of companies then to ally with civil society will get less. I'd only just like to come back on the point of the way in which companies can contribute to governance and delivery, and Peru, where rather contrary to every right principle, a very interesting experiment happened when the Garcia government came into power and said to the companies, we're not going to tear up your investment treaties, but if you don't agree to pay us some more money, we might. So why don't we make an agreement? You pay what are called voluntary contributions. And that money was then spent jointly through companies and an uncapacitated local government to actually deliver programs where rather surprisingly, the evidence seems to be that those programs were significantly better in terms of value for money and delivery than had otherwise happened. And whilst companies would be very reluctant to see that model replicated widely, it does have some arguments about how companies can actually augment management systems and deliverability.
Right, we'll continue on that. Yes.
Yeah, very quickly, I want to make sure we understand I did not say EITI is not useful or helpful. I want to make sure,
No, I didn't think you did, no.
Yeah.
You seem to say there's no improvement in Africa. I'm saying I think...
Well, what I'm saying is, first of all, let me acknowledge that, EITI has led to, information sharing. And in some countries, this has been critical. In my own country, oil production numbers were a state secret until the EITI process started really getting deep into it. And for the first time, the National Oil Company produce oil or share the production numbers. And this is what allow us to write finally a paper on oil production and find out actually what has been happening with the oil revenues. So EITI has helped tremendously. What I'm saying is, when we say countries are compliant, it sends the wrong message where countries actually turn around and say, well, we've done it all. And I have a specific country, I won't name it, where both IMF and World Bank have been pushing to have a little bit more transparency in the national oil company. And the country had agreed previously. And since becoming EITI compliant, they're telling us we don't need an audit anymore.
Yes.
So we are EITI compliant, go get, yeah? So this is the point I wanted to make. Thanks.
Okay. Let's get it started. Keith.
Okay, thanks very much for picking me first. It's getting a little bit frustrated there, actually, because because for me, governance is about making decisions and implementing. That's what governance is. And we seem to be focusing an awful lot on transparency. I mean, so you can have a functional system of governance that's opaque, and you can have a dysfunctional system of governance that's transparent. But the title of the session is about, governance. So, how do we make and implement good decisions, or make good decisions and implement them well with regard to resource governance to the benefit of citizens, and then conflate that with the political process. And what I'm interested in is how the political process can actually get in the way of making and implementing good decisions, the democratic process in many countries.
Thanks, Keith. We're going to collect a few questions from the audience. We go there, and please introduce yourself in each case. Indonesia.
Thank you. My name is Purwo Santoso from Indonesia.
Right.
I would like to throw the issue on the role of democratic governance in governing the resources. If I reflect from Indonesian experience, the ability of Indonesia to avoid resource curse was during the authoritarian rule. And therefore, the ability to make a maneuver and making good policy and implementing policy was during the strong government, which we label it as authoritarian one. And what I would like to pick up is the idea of strong government rather than marginalized government taken over by win-win solutions and transparency idea without putting idea of decision-making very seriously. And if we take up the idea of democracy as pre-requirement for natural resources governance, it seems very, very ambitious and very difficult because we are not starting from scratch. We need to have something in place beforehand. And if we reflect the comment on Malaysia, for example, when we talk about the role of parliament, in order to have elected, parliament have to have, party member or parliament member have to have invested the deed to the society. And doing so, they require resources. And therefore, there should be some sort of investment in the society prior to the elections. And this is what makes democratic and accountable parliament is very difficult because what citizens understand, what the people understand, is just letting the elite to be responsible with the policy making. And therefore, unless we have like well-educated and also sensitive people who be able to detect the problem rather than asking people to be assertive, then it's very, very difficult. So my point is that what we need to have is a strong government with strategic policies, and when we talk about good deal, it's not only dealing in financial terms, but also deal with the broad and strategic ideas, and this is what, in a way, Indonesia are secured from resource curse, and now we are somehow be able to manage the process of of managing the resources, even though criticism is already there. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to the back. Go to the back, one more, and then we'll come back. Okay, and the next stage.
I'm Jemine Kibber from Global Witness. There's a lot of talk about expanding the scope of transparency, for example. And one question I'm interested in is the question of land, which was touched on earlier, specifically large-scale land investments. We've done a lot of work in Southeast Asia, for example, looking at the negative impacts they can have. And Myanmar was one example of a country where decisions around land are completely secret. You have no idea if the military or cronies are involved, and that creates huge problems. So to what extent does the panel think that transparency initiatives can be expanded to cover these kinds of issues? And then on 1502, I don't work on it, my colleagues do, but just my understanding of it is that it wasn't so much that civil society stopped, or 1502 was ever intended to stop the trade of around minerals. It was more that companies chose to interpret 1502 that way. And I think that the kind of way that civil society has been portrayed is a huge problem. It was about, as I said earlier, getting companies to invest responsibly, not to stop companies investing altogether. Anyway.
Okay, and Lee for the Twitter question, and then we come back to the panel.
A few people on Twitter have picked up on this issue of the perhaps the semantics of compliance, which you alluded to, Claire, and you mentioned that compliance has been sort of misconstrued to mean a stamp of approval for good governance. And so Steve Levine, for example, who's an adjunct energy security professor at Georgetown, says, but that's what the original aim of EITI was. So what is the sort of difference between this label of compliance and actual good governance, and does it suggest maybe that there should be a relabeling of the concept?
Shall I answer?
Yes.
I think it's a real semantic problem, and I think it's a serious problem, and it's under discussion now whether we can change the language. Because, of course, when a country is found compliant, it's compliant with the reporting requirements of the EITI, which is a minimum to get some transparency into the system. But it doesn't mean what it sounds like. This is a compliant country, meaning it's managing this resource well, is the kind of general assumption of people. So I think we just need to change the language. A country can be found compliant with all our reporting requirements, but we should call them reporting countries. That is truthfully what they are. And of course, some reports are better than others, more extensive than others. Some of them lead to more public debate in the country and therefore more accountability.
So is the DRC a non-reporting country?
It's a candidate country. It's currently suspended but still working and has just submitted a report. It's actually really trying and making some significant improvements because it wants to be found compliant with our reporting requirements. But at the moment it isn't. It's having, yes, there's someone there, Jean-Pierre, is well informed about the position in the DRC. But the effort they're making is remarkable, given the difficulties of governance and this sector in that country.
In brief, because then I want to come back to the rest of the panel for the other question.
What I said this morning is that at least from the fact of having the EITI is that at least we hear about something is gone missing. It brings about a debate. We can sit and talk about it. We didn't have other means. But in relation to what the issue on Twitter, it looks like the EITI as initiatives needs probably the reporting should include more things that will make people think, okay, it means when they are compliant, it is complying with proper revenue distributions and proper costing and in the idea when the word compliance comes as if it has the approval of the IMF, the approval of this, that's probably the problem with the word, or we should define what should be reported. I think that's probably the problem.
Well, of course, in the next phase, there will be much wider reporting requirements, but I still want to move to reporting countries, personally.
While still giving them an incentive to continue.
Yes, but then they wouldn't be found compliant with the reporting clients and become a reporting country. But, yeah.
Now, I'd like to just respond to a few of the issues in terms of the presentation that I made. I think I'll start with the first point of that was made about governance is making decisions. I think that is right. But the problem which we have in our own country is that the decisions made are really central around the executive because of the enormous powers of the president that is granted by the Constitution. Majority of the decisions which affect the states are taken at that level. And that affects inclusiveness, it affects good governance, it affects fair rules, and many a time, those decisions are made in the context of protecting the party rather than the state. So it brings into focus issues that has to do with appointments, decisions about license, decisions about policies. It's not about what benefits the majority. It's a decision about what benefits my party so that the party can continue to be in office and to ensure that I compensate those people who voted for me. So the politics of compensation is really a very, very serious problem, and it affects the whole gamut of the society. And then on the issues of political and democratic process, the challenges implementing natural resource governance. Now, it flows from the first point which I made. The first point is that people see access to power as access to resources because of the level of poverty in most of countries in the South, and then the limited opportunities which people have. Now, people have conditioned their mind that the only way I can be able to reach up to the ladder wherein I can have houses, I can have wealth, is for me to have access to political power. So it clearly means that it's a huge challenge to implementation of resource governance because it means that all the different stakeholders, like people who are in the commercial world, people who are in your constituencies, all the other actors will support you because they believe that when you win the elections, you are going to ensure that the control of the natural resources is in their hands. So it has implications for what we call now, which we are talking about across West Africa. How do we deal with the issue of winner takes all? Because if you look at most of the constitutions in West Africa today, it's really about who wins the elections, has all the power, have all the access, makes all the major decisions. So it affects things like inclusiveness, compensation, ethnicity, and it's now deepening into ethnicity and regional divide. It's deepening into urban and rural divide because it means that areas which are my area in terms of politics are the areas which I can put more attention to, and it's also affecting the distribution of basic services, energy, electricity, water supply. But what we are saying is that in this process, we are trying to see how we can have an all-inclusive process. And then the issue of land. Part of the problem which we have is that it's land ownership. We have land ownership systems which some of them provides more opportunity for some people than the other. So we are talking about how do we liberalize the issue of land ownership. And then it also has to do with the manner in which they administer lands in some of our countries is very, very corrupt. You can have a land, they can give the land to 3 or 4 people, and all of them will have title deeds, which creates a problem. And the other has to do with traditional land ownership system. In those days, maybe 50 years ago or 100 years ago, you have land owning families. They were on those lands and doing work. But now that minerals have been found on those lands, there is now a law that says the minerals belong to the state. You own the land, the rent will be paid to you. So it has created so much problem. And companies, again, want to expand their land space. So it means that they are now going into situations where they need to relocate people and provide social services in other areas, which has got huge, huge implications. And finally, this EITI, I think it's very good to think about the use of the word compliance. Because in some of the countries, the moment they say the country is EITI compliance, it's as if I am no longer corrupt. I have a free, and so many things are happening. But then, because that has been given to them, they feel that they have been immunized from all kinds of issues.
Great.
Thank you, Danny. The question on governance, I think is absolutely pertinent. And if I could put my little World Bank hat on, on this area, we are actually working with countries to address these issues of implementation, right? What we're doing, for example, in countries like Uganda, it's to have an expensive program for the demand for good governance, which is basically the demand side programs. We're working with civil society, but we're also helping the country to build supreme institutions of audit and all the control agencies. And we were quite pleased. Well, it was a bittersweet, victory, in the sense that, the latest corruption scandal, largest corruption scandal in the past 5 years in Uganda, was actually unearthed by Ugandan, equivalent of the coup de con. It's bitter because it led to us being forced to suspend our budget support to Uganda because it was extremely serious. But it was actually good for us because for the past 5 years, we've been working with Uganda to strengthen these institutions of accountability. So we're doing this work for implementing this on the ground. In countries like the DRC, well, if you look at the budget of DRC, I mean, it's mind-boggling with so much resources, but a budget that is not even the equivalent of that of, a province. I wouldn't even want to go there. But the problem is that fragility and conflict have really decimated the civil service. So we're working with them to build the capacity of the civil service, and we just recently got a project to launch a young professionals program within the civil service in DRC that would attract people, including from the diaspora, and help the country, actually help the administration to be able to function and to actually implement those policies.
Why would
Yes.
now make a difference? I mean, as a former World Banker, I was saying the same thing about DRC and the World Bank and technical assistance capacity we built in 15 years ago. So how many decades of technical assistance and capacity building in the technocratic way for public sector management, not only DRC, but many of the others? What's different now?
Well, what's different, particularly in this case, is that we are actually scaling up a project that started in the Prime Minister's office. So it's not World Bank coming with a solution, a ready-made solution, but the Prime Minister, who has been there for the past 3-4 years and who has actually been doing quite an impressive work on the macro side, has actually initiated that and came to us just to help them to scale. Yeah, absolutely. So we just scaling. No, not I wouldn't say the same thing either. So yeah, we agree on that one.
We will go. We will have a little more time because we started a bit late. Because I want to go back to the audience, and then we'll come back and begin to conclude. So, I know that there were some hands raised earlier that we didn't fully take into account. Yes.
Thank you. Abu from Sierra Leone. I just wanted to, zero on the issue of, governance as is being required for in the EITI process, and to say that, compliance status could mean a lot to many people, different people. In fact, like Memuna was saying, it's probably a passport in many ways to some governments to, do other things that they will go away with. And I don't know how the extent of rigor put into the assessment to make countries compliant. Because as a member of MSG in my country, I know that a lot of effort was made in terms of, getting companies to give information, disclose, putting some institutions, governance institutions to also, declare. But I also know that there were a lot of hitches and problems within even the actual governing body of the EITI, the MSG, in terms of the composition, the inclusiveness has a lot of questions, in terms of the decision-making processes, in terms of the engagement, you know. So there are, and I don't know, I mean, when the emphasis is it on the governance dimension or the economic aspect, which has to do with the taxes or the revenue? Because there seems to be some, you know, this disconnect or disparity in terms of which one is assessed more than the others, and which criteria has more weight than others when the real assessment is done to bring about compliance. And when we have been debating now, recently, we had a meeting on Monday, and we said we're going to begin to redefine the parameters of, you know, how we continue to sustain the compliance and what for us would actually mean, you know, good governance within the EITI framework. Because we think that a lot of things went the way we thought couldn't have gone.
Thank you. Philip.
Thank you, Danny. Philip Daniel from the IMF. I'd just like to express some fellow feeling from us with Claire and the EITI, because of course we know in our institution that compliance with one of our programs and meeting our criteria means lots of good things, but it doesn't mean everything is perfect. And I think perhaps the EITI will now have some empathy with us as a result of its very considerable success. And I would simply like to say that without the founding of the EITI and the adoption of its principles in 2003, and I was lucky enough to be there as part of a country delegation, I don't think any of us would be here. I think the foundations of this are the EITI. There's always room for lots of improvement, for broadening on governance and so on, but I think credit where it is due.
Thank you. We'll begin. Okay, let's get back to the panel because of the issue of time. We'll give.
Can I just respond to our friend from Sierra Leone? Sierra Leone's just been found compliant with the EITI's minimum reporting requirements, and congratulations for that. But that's a means to an end. It just means you're meeting the transparency and the multi-stakeholder requirements, and they are rigorously enforced. And as you know, they're going to become more ambitious in the next phase. And they're rigorous, but they're a means to an end, not an end in itself. And that's been one of the problems. Some countries want the label compliant, and then they think they've made it. But it should be that transparency is a means to manage the resources better for the benefit of the people. But in your next round, when you start to operate under the new rules agreed at Sydney, one of the things you on the multi-stakeholder group will have to say at first is, why are we, Sierra Leone, doing this EITI? What is it that our country needs, and what is it that this will help us to achieve? So some of your questions will be back to you. Yes, EITI will rigorously say, here's the minimum, but we'll say to you, don't just send the report to Oslo, say to yourselves, what's good for Sierra Leone? How can we use transparency to improve the management of these resources for our country? And each country will be doing that. And thank you, IMF. And may I say, since Christine Lagarde came to London and then to Maputo and told everyone there's too much inequality, I am becoming a desperate fan of the IMF.
Now we're in trouble. Before, we would have let everybody in the panel have concluding comment. Humberto had a question? No? You passed. So you agree with everything about Peru?
Oh, yes, I could say something about that.
Yeah, Peru is a great example.
It's important, yeah.
What it was said, I am Humberto Campodónico from the University of San Marcos in Lima. Former head of Petroperú, yes.
That's important.
Yes, well, concerning that program of 2006 of President Alan Garcia, where the mining companies made an agreement with the government in order to spend a quantity of money. And I would have to say two things, one good and one bad, let's say. The good one was that for the first time in Latin America, a baseline was traced in every company or in every mine in relation to the project that they were going to develop, social project, education project, infrastructure, in order to know what was going to be the impact of the investment you were making. Because in other expenses in Latin America, you just spend the money in infrastructure or something else, but you don't have an assessment of the impact. So you don't know exactly what you're doing with that money, even though it might be done for a good means. So that was very good. But the fact of the matter is not that has not been replicated, I would say, which is not good. It is that this was changed, or this was done in exchange of not putting a higher tax on the mining enterprises at the moment, which was the big discussion. So this was a voluntary contribution of mining enterprises, and it was administered by them. It was good, very well administered by them with this, but the nation lost a lot of revenue coming from tax and not a voluntary contribution. That was what the government had proposed initially. So, thank you.
Thanks. Okay. We'll have 1 minute each of the combination of concluding remark and feedback to any of the relevant questions to you. We will start with you, Arthur, and then go in this direction.
Thank you, Danny. It was a very interesting session, and just few concluding remarks. First is, to me, EITI and transparency, progress in transparency in Africa has been, very good, but the agenda ahead of us is to, yes, enormous, but is to actually translate those progress in transparency into holding the governments and parliaments truly accountable. To me, that's the most important agenda in that respect. The private sector is another side of the same coin, which is in Asia or in Africa, civil servants are under tremendous pressure, and it's difficult for a government official in poor countries not to be tempted by corruption. It's difficult, we have to factor that in, and it's true everywhere where I've worked. The third point I would like to make is, national oil companies or sovereign wealth funds, and most of them are being created. It's important to shed light into that black box. Corporate governance should be, on the agenda, and we should really strengthen the way leaders of these companies are actually selected, the way the executive of these companies are selected, and how do we ensure there is some commerciality to the way they do business? If possible, how can they be managed as private company, even if they're managing sovereign wealth? So that's probably one area. And last point, as more countries discover natural resources, most of them are scaling up public investment. The governance challenge is going to be moving forward into managing these increased investments. And if we're not careful, we'll be spending again, most of these countries, especially in Central Africa, and East Africa, will be spending a tremendous amount of money, and there will be nothing left at the end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, as a way of concluding, I think we still need to bear in mind that for countries to succeed in implementing very good natural resource governance policies, I think there should be the implementation of good governance policies and institutions. I see a very strong correlation between having sound democratic institutions that are working with the implementation of natural resource governance policies. If you have a very good, effective, and accountable national governance system, you are sure to have very good natural resource governance principles to be implemented. So I still feel that there is a strong correlation, especially in the context in which we work. Because if you talk about fiscal regime, you are talking about both sides, strengthening our fiscal laws and strengthening our financial accountability system. If that is done, then I think we have got a good way to go with regards to natural resource governance. So there is a strong correlation, and we should try to see how does the national laws and policies are related to the implementation of the Natural Resource Charter. And the second point is, for instance, like in Sierra Leone, we are talking about revenue distribution. But we are not seeing that being reflected in the lives of people who live in the mining areas. Now we see roads being constructed. But if you look at people, and then if you look at the human development indicators, you see mass suffering, you see high inflation. Now, if we allow this disparity to grow, are we sitting back and waiting for another opportunity for people to revert back into violence? Because if you do not have effective systems of distributing the wealth, then those people who are in the areas where the diamonds and revenues are coming from similarly will become aggrieved, and it will result to conflicts and then a very serious problem. And then we also need to look at the issue of the companies. Companies really need to be very sincere and then to abide by the legal and regulatory agreements which they sign up to. I think those are my last comments.
Thank you, Mamuna. Ed?
3 comments. First of all, on 1502, I think there will be an increasing...
Tell people what it is.
Sorry, Section 1502, sorry if we've been carrying on this insiders dialogue around conflict minerals in the Eastern DRC. I think that there will be an increasing trend to...
This is part of the Dodd-Frank financial sector reform.
Although these particular bits of Dodd-Frank had nothing to do with the financial reform, but so there were these 3 extra bits. So 1502 related to tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold sourced from the DRC and surrounding countries. I think there will be an increasing trend towards responsible sourcing in the metals industry. The problem, particularly with that piece of legislation, was it sort of came out of nowhere, designed in the north for implementation by northern companies, and the impact was immediate and quite devastating for some people's livelihoods. Well-intentioned, but these sorts of things need multi-stakeholder international cooperation to make them work. Hopefully, using the OECD sorts of guidance for the future, we can begin to get these things right rather than being just one region specific. Secondly, we've talked a lot about revenues in the last few days. I think one of the key challenges going forward is also to think more about the capacities to spend well, because that will have the biggest single impact on the lives of poor people. And thirdly, Michael Ross said last night, well, I think he was provoking us about how little progress in some senses we've made about understanding what needs to be done to move from the sick man to the well man. And I think that there is certainly a long way from nirvana, but actually looking back 10 years, there's an awful lot more understanding, certainly in the corporate sector. It's not saying that all of it is implemented, about the ways in which companies in the extractive sector can play a constructive role as development partners, development actors rather than development agencies. But I think there's a crucial issue that we're still finding a disconnect around understanding of what drives expectations of different stakeholders. So there's really quite often not an understanding that at the moment, for example, in the mining sector, investors are virtually on strike because they say they haven't got enough returns to the industry, whilst many host governments think that the companies will run away with the money. And those sorts of, those different perceptions need to come together so that the issues that drive business models are better understood.
Great.
I want to say that improvements in governance and entrenching competent government systems is a long-term job. And a lot of campaigning and international development has short-term fashions and lots of conferences, and then they think the work is done. I think there has been considerable progress in Africa, in South America, post the dictatorships, building democratic, open, pluralistic systems, in the former Soviet, Mongolia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. But this doesn't happen in a day. And we've got to persist and be there, and not just be people outsiders pontificating, but get locals engaged and on the ground, and they're doing it too. And that is happening, but we've got to persist and sustain. And I think there has been achievement up to now, but there's no way is it a job done. But building on the fact that there's been some progress makes you optimistic, or makes me optimistic, that there can be more if we all persist and sustain and keep the whole coalition together. And I just say another thing on spend well. I mean, how the money of a country is spent is the essence of the political accountability of a country. So some people say, well, the EITI should do this, but I mean, it's essentially a deeply political accountability question. But some of spend well is spend on what for whom. It's that big inequality. Is it lots of infrastructure to help the companies, or is it getting the kids to school and vaccinated and basic health care? And that's intensely political. But there's no doubt for both economic reasons and stability reasons in all our countries, because this includes, in my view, the OECD countries and the United States, which is the most unequal of the OECD. We've got to be more inclusive. When we talk about economic growth, it's just not a number. It's got to be bringing some benefit to everybody, and you'll get more stability. That's part of spend well. And it's intensely political, but it's also very important for this transparency, inclusiveness, making countries stable, maybe making everyone feel they've been invited to the party and they're getting some benefits.
Great. I cannot do full justice to this rich panel, so I'm not going to summarize, but I will take the prerogative of being the provocateur for having a few reflections that touch on the points that you have all made. One area was obviously semantics. So let's go from perhaps the second order to the first order issue. Although semantics can become important, so the notion of compliance creates a lot of allergies, so it needs to be revisited. I have enormous concern about the notion of supreme institutions, which in the World Bank and others they like to have. So there's a significant job about semantics, ministries of information, right? Ministries of planning. Don't get me going. But then let's move to more important issues. Although semantics are important, and obviously the issue of accountability came in very squarely. I cannot help, and that's at a more personal level, because the great examples and discussion that took place about certain countries, yours, Sierra Leone, commitment about that, Indonesia, we heard, Peru, Chile, my own country, very briefly. 1988, late 1988, the dictator in power, Augusto Pinochet, is so confident because he has done effective management. The economy is growing again after major periods of problem, that he says, I'm going to stay in power for 10 more years, and since the economy is growing again, and since I'm going to do a plebiscite that I can basically manage, I'm going to stay 10 more years. So he does a plebiscite that says yes or no to 10 more years in power. It's a whole story of what happened to hold him accountable with underground civil society, which were brilliant computer and statistician geeks. It has been written up in the Royal Journal of Statistics, of the models that were used, because there had not been elections for so long, you couldn't use basically previous elections. But essentially, he could not cheat. So he loses that night. The next morning, the only irreverent newspaper that was still exist became very famous heading. It says, the old fart ran alone and came in second. which became famous. Anyway, the day he leaves, after that growth spurts and effective management, Chile, the proportion of the poor, or the proportion of the population living under the poverty line is 48%. Today, it's 13, okay?
So 3-0.
1-3, 1-3. So A, it can be done, and it can be done in a generation, and B, democratic governance has to be basically integrated with the notion, the technocratic of effective management. I know you may be thinking about Saudi Arabia and other things, and there are some exceptions, and we can talk about Singapore and so on, but we in Latin America see it a bit differently. And so the issue of accountability is absolutely crucial. What had happened, and even when you grow in those circumstances, that growth is captured by obviously the elite. So Chile became incredibly unequal during that time. So we shouldn't just look at growth. That leads to the third and before last point in terms of perspective. So it's a perspective about substance, and there's been a lot of discussion here on very substantive themes and issues, but throughout the conference, ranging from the complete skeptic that we know nothing because we haven't distilled the lessons and we are so ignorant about what works, to the other extreme of presentations that at least convey complete certitude that we know what we're doing and these are the solutions. Obviously, it's somewhere in between. And we do know when there is egregious misgovernance. And we have learned enough of what doesn't work, but we've learned also some very useful lessons that then need to be obviously tailored at the country level. And that leads to the question of perspective on what we're doing at the country level. So there are great stories, and we should be optimistic because it can be done, and the Chiles and the Perus, and there are a few countries in Africa that are showing that, yes, it can be done. But not one word has been mentioned today about two countries I care deeply about today or yesterday. Maybe in some panels I wasn't there. One, Alex Gillis, our head of governance, you showed a great graph today of work has been done in NRGI, showing what's the percentage of oil receipts in the total budget. And you had the whole range between 10% to 100%. This one country is 100% of oil sales in the budget. That country, today, as we speak, is about to collapse, right? And that's Iraq, okay? So it should bring us at least a notion of perspective of what we are confronting and what we're talking about here, which is we care so much about this initiative, EITI and so on. But it's a much larger picture in terms of the politics, in terms of the conflict, that we all need to be mindful, and that tempers our. Likewise, a country I lived in is Ukraine. And what has been going on in Ukraine, ever since Yanukovych is put out of power, he flees, his huge villa and dacha is fully exposed. This is the billions he stole from what? This was related to natural resources again. So there is a broader picture that at least should give us pause to reflect that it's not all about technocratic, very specialized and specific solutions and decisions that shows the enormity of the challenge. Which leads to the last point, and Claire was mentioning that we are here for the long haul. We should be very patient. So the last point is about patience, but I want to suggest a slightly different variant. Yes, it's a long haul. Yes, it doesn't take 2 to 3 years, but a lot can be done in one generation. But given the magnitude of the challenge, and Iraq today, it's a potent and perhaps extreme example, but it's not unique.
But it's not only caused by mismanagement of natural
No,
resources.
not only.
Forces.
Of course there are bigger causes. No, but there are.
EITI
But the point is that, no, you cannot blame in the EITI or in EITI. But wouldn't you agree that at the end of the day, significant progress happens only with persistent impatience.
Oh, yeah.
So we need also a certain degree of getting into an era of more impatience. Being realistic of what can be achieved in the short term, you're absolutely right.
I didn't say patience, I said sustain.
Okay.
Sustain your impatience.
So to conclude, we have achieved something very special, which is consensus with Claire. Which often we do with the stage, which is wonderful. But beyond, I mean, this has been a great panel, but in a seamless way, let's move to conclude this with Jim. And maybe, Tony, can you come for a second? So then let's close it. We'll be very brief. Everybody stays. We'll bring one more chair, perhaps. You want to go first? Sure. So, goes to Jim, which I would only say that enormous credit to what has happened here is because of Jim and the team that works with Jim, that are working effectively on this for months and months in putting this together. And I'm sure Jim will mention other people too. Go ahead.
Sure. Okay, so I've got only 3 very brief things to say. First, some housekeeping. A phone, a BlackBerry, has been handed in, so if anybody's missing their BlackBerry, then come and get it from me at the end. The slides from various presentations where they're able to be shared will be shared with all of you next week, and we'll be sending that round along with a feedback form so you can tell us what we got right, what we got wrong, and how we can do better. Second of 3 things is an apology, which is that we came dangerously close to scheduling dinner to clash with Brazil's opening match. Judging by how many of you were in the pub afterwards, I think we just about got away with it, but it was a close call. And third and finally is some thank yous. So, as Danny mentioned, a lot of work has gone into the conference, and it certainly wasn't all done by me. Firstly, the staff of St. Anne's and the catering team. Celia Kingham, Tony Venables, and our co-hosts with Oxcar have done a lot. The filming team, the guys at the back. From NRGI, a huge amount of work has gone into this from Alex Tilley, David Mahaly, Rob Pittman, David Manley, Helen Dempsey, and many others. And of course, I have to thank all of the chairs, panelists, and everybody here for their contributions and 2 days of very vibrant discussion. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I think Jim's done just about all the thanks, except to himself, of course, who is the real driver of the local end here and the whole of the NRGI end. I've been absent through much of today because there's another conference going on natural resources, which is really rather exciting. There are, research innovations going on, big data sets, subnational stuff. People really beginning to get a hold of local impact on local communities, how the mine, its impact spreads out. So I did want to say that. Real innovations. We're still talking about some rather old-fashioned sounding issues like Dutch disease, but there's a lot of really new, exciting stuff going on as well. So that's all happening in parallel. But once again, thanks to everyone who worked putting it together, Jim, and of course to the audience, the participants, I shouldn't call it the audience, the participants in this project. Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to also thank all the participants throughout these 2 days, which have been very special during the sessions, but also the off sessions. But let's finish also with a round of applause for the great panel we had. And